Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
No man could say what had become of Jeremy Lester, the last resident owner of the Whitaker estate. He was in the parlor one Christmas Eve, and by the next morning had disappeared. Overnight, one Mr. Worley, a great friend of Jeremy's, had sat playing cards with him until after 12 o'clock. Then he took leave and rode home under the moonlight. After that, no person, as far as could be ascertained, ever saw Jeremy Lester alive. His ways of life had not been the most respectable or regular, and it was not until the new year that his servants became seriously alarmed concerning his absence. Authorities set out on foot, searching as weeks and months passed by without the slightest clue of Jeremy's whereabouts. Advertisements ran, and rewards were offered, but still, Jeremy made no reappearance. Eventually, the estate was given to the heir, an overworked lawyer named Paul Lester. He took possession of the house in the dead of summer and settled in with his wife and her 4 children from a previous husband. But when the winter snows returned, he took his family back from where they'd come. He sold most of the land surrounding the house, boarded up the hall, hired a live-in caretaker, and never troubled himself further about the place. As time went on, people whispered that the house was haunted. The family had been living a life most only could dream of, and something must have caused the sudden departure. 41 years passed before Paul died and I succeeded to the Whitaker estate. There could not have been found in the world a happier pair than myself and my only sister, Claire. We'd never met the man, and what little we heard was unfavorable. At his hands, we'd never received a single benefit. Now, his loss was certainly our gain. The fortune, though, had been spent. Lester spent his years traveling and throwing lavish parties at his penthouse in the city. I quickly heard the absurd stories afloat about the house being haunted. Supposedly, Jeremy's spirit wandered the grounds, seen by poachers or playing children, or lovers searching for a quiet place beneath the elms. As for the caretaker, the third in residence since Lester's disappearance, he shook his head gravely when questioned. The first thing I did was proceed to the parlor, tear open the shutters, and let the bright August sun stream in upon the haunted chamber. It was an old-fashioned, plainly furnished room, with a large table in the center, a fireplace with a smaller table nearby, and chairs against the walls. There were figurines on the hearth, broken and rusty. There was a picture of some sea fight over the mantelpiece, while another work of art about equal in merit hung between the windows. Altogether, the room was utterly unromantic, and the ghosts flitted away as soon as I let the daylight inside. I made plans to redecorate, refurnish, and convert it into a pleasant morning room, and there were many other nooks and corners to explore, long neglected, filled with old chests and cupboards and the faces of our ancestors looking down from the walls. The overgrown garden, full of weeds, was filled with untamely shrubs and birdweed. There was grass on the paths and trailing brambles over the ground. Yet, the Whitaker estate looked quite pretty in its state of uncivilized picturesqueness. At the end of August, Claire and I decided on going abroad to take our long-talked-of holiday before the fine weather was past. We wandered the continent, seeing galleries in Paris, and became acquainted with a family after accidentally discovering that we were near neighbors back home. In fact, their property lay close beside the estate. Mr. and Mrs. Cronson were a delightful pair, and before long we were traveling in company. It was the middle of November when we arrived home to the Whitaker and found the place anything but pleasant. The walks were wet and sodden, the trees were leafless, there were no flowers. It had been a wet season, and the place looked miserable. The ghost stories we had laughed at while sunshine flooded in the room became less unreal when we had nothing but blazing fires and wax candles to dispel the gloom. They became even more real as servant after servant left us to seek situations elsewhere, when noises grew frequent in the house, when we ourselves, Claire and I, with our own ears, heard the trampling and banging that had been described to us. Being practical people and unlike our predecessors, not having money to live where and how we liked, we decided to watch and see whether we could trace any human influence in the matter. If not, it was agreed we were to pull down the right wing of the house and the principal staircase. For nights and nights, we sat up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I read book after book as Claire engaged in needlework, with a revolver lying on the table between us. But nothing, neither sound nor appearance, rewarded our vigil. This confirmed my first ideas that the sounds were not supernatural, but just to test the matter, I determined, on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of Mr. Jeremy Lester's disappearance, to keep watch myself in the red bedroom. Even to Claire, I never mentioned my intention. About 10, we each retired to rest. I noisily shut the door of my room, and when I opened it half an hour afterwards, no mouse could have moved along the corridor with greater silence than myself. I sat in darkness in the red room. When the moon rose high, strange lights cast across the floor and walls of the haunted chamber. But no sound broke the silence. I had dropped into a slumber when I was waked by the sound of the door softly opening.
John, are you here?"
said my sister, just above a whisper. "I'm here," I answered.
"They're in the parlor."
I did not need any further explanation as to whom she meant, and crept down the stairs after her, warned by an uplifted hand at the necessity for silence and caution. Dreamlike music echoed softly from the parlor, which we had left in darkness. Now a bright fire blazed, with flickering candles adorning the chimney-piece and the small table pulled from its corner, where 2 men sat playing cards. It looked like they'd just returned from a great party. The younger man was decorated with the costume of a bygone period, and powdered hair with lace ruffles on his wrists. His little finger wore a sparkling ring, with a matching diamond on the front of his shirt. There were diamond buckles in his shoes, and he wore knee breeches and silk stockings, which showed off advantageously the shape of a remarkably good leg and ankle. The man was Jeremy Lester, who had been missing for 41 years that very night. He sat opposite the door, but never once lifted his eyes. His attention seemed concentrated on the cards. In the doorway we stood, holding our breath, terrified and yet fascinated by the scene before us. The ashes dropped on the hearth, softly, like the snow. We could hear the rustle of the cards as they were dealt out and fell upon the table, but there was no word spoken till, at length, the player whose face we could not see exclaimed,
"I win! The game is mine!"
But Jeremy took up the cards and flung them in his guest's face, exclaiming,
"Cheat! Liar! Take that!"
There was a bustle and confusion, and we could not hear a sentence which was uttered. All at once, however, Jeremy Lester strode out of the room in so great a hurry that he almost touched us where we stood, and trampled up the staircase to the red room. He returned with 2 rapiers, and they walked into the night air. We followed through the garden and down a narrow, winding walk to a smooth piece of turf, sheltered from the north by trees. The moon was still bright, and we could distinctly see Jeremy Lester hovering just above the ground. A handsomer fellow I had never beheld.
"When you say 3,
He said at last to his opponent.
1,
Began the man, whose face remained in shadow.
2,
And before Jeremy had the slightest suspicion, the man was on him, plunging his rapier straight through his breast. Claire screamed aloud, and the combatants disappeared, and the moon was obscured behind a cloud. We shivered with cold and terror, but we knew at last what had become of the late owner of the Whittaker, foully murdered by a false friend. When late on Christmas morning I awoke, it was to see a white world, such snow as no person could remember having fallen for 41 years. When the snow melted away, we searched the property, and in a shallow grave within the plantation, Jeremy Lester's body was found. He still wore his diamonds, the grayed ring sitting loosely on a rotting little finger bone. We were never taken seriously when we shared the events of that Christmas Eve. The Cronsons returned to their property for the first time since their vacation, having visited Mr. Cronson's ailing father, and invited us over for lunch. As they led us to the garden, Claire dropped the glass she carried, and it shattered across the floor.
John!
She exclaimed, face as white as the tablecloth. She was staring at a portrait on the wall.
That's him!
What happened next, I have only the vaguest recollection. Servants rushed in, and Mrs. Cronson fell from her chair in hysterics. Her 4 crying daughters gathered round. Mr. Cronson furiously attempted some explanation as Claire begged to leave, only to be taken away. I took her away, not only from the Cronson property, but from the Whitaker estate. I returned to speak with Mr. Cronson, who shared that the portrait Claire identified was his wife's father, Jeremy's friend, and the last man to see him alive. The man had confessed everything to his son just before he died.
You won't bring further sorrow upon us by making this matter public?
He asked me. I promised him I would keep silence, and similarly, the house was peaceful after that Christmas night. But eventually, the story oozed out of me, and the Cronsons moved away. My sister married and left for the city, never to return to the Whitaker estate. But for myself, I adore the aging home. It was a few nights before Christmas, and the locals were busy making extensive preparations for the festival. The narrow streets, usually thronged with people, were now almost deserted, and the last shops open were rapidly closing for the night. In the comfortable coffee room of the Old Boar's Head, 6 guests, mostly travelers for work, sat talking by the light of the fire. The talk had drifted from trade to politics, from politics to religion, and naturally from religion to the supernatural. The first 3 stories fell flat, though they'd never failed before. It may have been the noise from outside or the well-lit interior of the room. A man snuffed the lanterns before telling the 4th story, and the streets had gone quiet, and the room was enthralled. So enthralled that the entire group gasped when the waiter, George, spoke from the dark corner of the room, having been temporarily forgotten by the others. "That's what I call a good story," he said in the low, flickering light of the fire. "But there's a ghost in this very house, you know." The others, even the locals, hadn't heard of it. "It dates back a long time now," the gentleman continued, "but surely one of you has heard the name of Jerry Bundler." One of the others, a man named Hurst, spoke up. "Well, I've just heard odds and ends, but I never put much count to 'em. But the staff would be sacked prompt if they even mentioned it." "It's true," continued George. "My father worked here before me and knew the story well. He was a truthful man and steady churchgoer, and he swore until he died that he had seen the ghost of Jerry Bundler in this house. He was a vagabond pickpocket and thief who checked in for Christmas some 80 years ago. He ate his last supper right here where we sit and went up to bed. A pocket watch had fallen from his pack to the floor, but when a runner attempted to deliver it to his room, not knowing it was stolen property, of course, there was no answer from the stout oak door. Assuming he'd fallen quickly asleep, they set the watch aside for him to retrieve at breakfast. In the morning, the man remained in his room. As the afternoon neared, the staff knocked on his door once again, obtaining no answer. One worker went out to the courtyard and with a short ladder climbed onto the windowsill, while another waited outside the door. With a sudden smash of glass, the worker fell with a cry and landed in a heap on the stones below. As others gathered around him, they saw the pale face of the thief peeping down from the window above. Others joined the runner to break the door in, which had now been barred by heavy furniture. When they finally gained entrance, the first thing that met their eyes was the man's body, dangling from the top of the bed by his own handkerchief. "Which bedroom was it?" a man named Malcolm asked. The waiter shook his head. "That I can't tell you, but the story goes that Bundler still haunts this house, and my father declared positively that the last time he slept here, the spirit lowered himself from the top of his bed and tried to strangle him." The group grumbled, eager to guess in which room the terrible events took place. "There's nothing to fear," the waiter continued. "I don't believe for a moment that ghosts could really hurt someone. My father confessed that it was the unpleasantness of it all that upset him the most. Jerry's fingers might have been made of cotton wool for all the harm they could do." A mix of frightened and frustrated, the bulk of the group began heading to bed. George refilled a handful of whiskey glasses for the men that remained before leaving the room to begin his final tasks of the evening. Hurst scoffed at the waiter's bravery, telling the others he'd find a way to put him to the test. Leaving the fire, he ran lightly up the stairs to his room to wrangle about his proceedings. Nearly half an hour passed, and the others began to grow bored. 2 more men had retired from the fire to their bedrooms, leaving only a pair left downstairs. Suddenly, George burst into the room and rushed towards them. "He's here!" he shouted breathlessly, but the men only laughed. "In the kitchen. I didn't look for seeing him. There's only a glimmer of light in there, and he was sitting on the floor behind the counter. I nearly trod on him." The others continued laughing. "You're frightened, George," Malcolm said. "You'll never make a man." "Well, it took me unawares," said the waiter. "Not that I'd have gone to the kitchen by myself if I'd known he was there, and I don't believe you would either, sir." "Nonsense," the man retorted. "I'll go and fetch him now." But George stopped him with a catch of his sleeve. "You don't know what it's like, sir. It ain't fit to look by yourself." He was cut off by a smothered cry from the staircase and the sounds of someone stomping along the passage. Suddenly, the door flew open and a figure burst into the room. George yelled in fear and stumbled backwards as the others made fun. Lighting the lantern, George could now see it was only Hurst. He had changed into knee breeches and a coat, a massive wig gone awry, and his face was fully greased. As the light flickered in the glass of the windows, the group realized that Hurst was trembling and gasping for air. "I've seen it," said Hurst with a hysterical sob. "The ghost, whatever it is. I was coming down the stairs and I felt a tap." He broke off suddenly and peered nervously through the open door into the passage. "I thought I saw it again," he whispered. "No, there's nothing there," said George, whose own voice shook a little. "Go on. You felt a tap on your shoulder." "I turned round and saw it. A wicked, pale, white, dead face." "That's what I saw in the kitchen," said George. Hurst shuddered and dropped into a chair. "It's the last time I come to this house," he stated. "I leave tomorrow myself," said George. "I wouldn't return to that kitchen again for £50. "It's uttering the man's name that caused it, I expect," said Hurst. "Having it in our minds. Practically, we've been forming a spiritualistic circle without knowing it." "It's odd that they should both think they saw something," said Malcolm, feeling uneasy for the first time. "I saw it as plain as I see you, sir," said George solemnly. "Perhaps if you keep your eyes turned up the passage, you'll see it for yourself." They followed the direction of his finger, but saw nothing. "Who'll come down to the kitchen with me?" said Malcolm, looking around. "You can go if you like," said Hurst. "We'll wait here for you." The stout traveler walked towards the door and took a few steps up the passage. Then he stopped. All was quite silent, and he walked slowly to the end and looked down fearfully towards the glass partition which shut off the kitchen. As he neared, he couldn't bring himself to go to it, and looking over his shoulder, rushed back to the room. "Did you see it, sir?" whispered George. "Nothing at all," said Malcolm shortly. "Even as I fancy seeing anything just now, I saw nothing." Hurst sighed and finished his glass of whiskey. "Oh, I feel better now. I dare say you think I'm easily scared, but you didn't see it." "Not at all," said Malcolm, smiling faintly despite himself. "I'm going to bed," said Hurst, noticing the smile and resenting it. He rose from his seat and bid the company a friendly good night, having heard his door close. Malcolm said, "I never saw a man so scared in all my life. Sort of poetic justice about it, isn't there?" But as he looked to George and the others, he saw fear in their eyes. One of them asked if anyone wanted to share a room for the night. "I will," said Malcolm. The other man who remained, Mr. Leek, scoffed. "I don't believe in ghosts," he said. "If anything comes into my room, I'll simply shoot it." "Bullets don't pierce spirits, Mr. Leek," George suggested. "Well, the noise would certainly wake the whole house," he laughed. "But if you're nervous, sir, the others will be only too pleased for you to sleep on the doormat inside their room, surely. If you gentlemen would only come down with me to put the gas out, I could never be sufficiently grateful." Malcolm and his newfound roommate joined him, peering carefully before them as they went. They snuffed the light without issue and returned to the lobby, extinguishing the gas there, too, and leaving the small group in the dim light of a single candle. Suddenly, they distinctly heard a step in the passage outside. It stopped at the door, and as they watched with bated breath, the door creaked and slowly opened. Malcolm fell back open-mouthed as a white, leering face with sunken eyeballs and close-cropped bullet head appeared at the opening. For a few seconds, the creature stood regarding them, blinking in a strange fashion at the candle. Then, with a sliding movement, it came a little way into the room and stood there as if bewildered. Not a man spoke or moved, but all watched with a horrible fascination as the creature removed its dirty neckcloth, its broken neck allowing his head to flop onto its shoulder. For a minute it paused, and then moved toward George with the cloth outstretched. There was a sudden flash and loud crashing noise, and the candle went out. In the pitch black, the men heard the sounds of a chair moving and something writhing on the floor. George struck a match and leapt to light the burner again. Malcolm felt ahead of him, touching the thing on the floor and finding it soft. With the candle lit again, he kneeled down and examined the thing, then rose swiftly, dipping his handkerchief into the water jug and returning to wipe away the white face. Leek's pistol fell to the floor as Malcolm sprang back with a cry of incredulous horror, leaning against the wall, deathly sick, and falling into the waiter's arms. Nobody spoke. They simply stared, spellbound, at the still, dead face of Hurst on the floor before them.
John Mudbury was on his way home from the shops, his arms full of Christmas presents. It was after 6 o'clock, and the streets were very crowded. He was an ordinary man, lived in an ordinary suburban flat, with an ordinary wife and ordinary children. He did not think them ordinary, but everybody else did. He had ordinary presents for each one: a cheap blotter for his wife, a cheap air gun for the boy, and so forth. He was over 50, bald, in an office, decent in mind and habits, of uncertain opinions, uncertain politics, and uncertain religion. Yet he considered himself a decided, positive gentleman, quite unaware that the morning newspaper determined his opinions for the day. He just lived, from day to day. Physically, he was fit enough, except for a weak heart, which never troubled him. and his summer holiday was bad golf, while the children bathed and his wife read Garvice on the sands. Like the majority of men, he dreamed idly of the past, muddled away the present, and guessed vaguely, after imaginative reading on occasion, at the future. "I'd like to survive all right," he said, "provided it's better than this," surveying his wife and children and thinking of his daily toil. "Otherwise," and he shrugged his shoulders as a brave man should. He went to church regularly, but nothing in church convinced him that he did survive, just as nothing in church enticed him into hoping that he would. On the other hand, nothing in life persuaded him that he didn't, wouldn't, couldn't. "I am an evolutionist," he loved to say to thoughtful cronies over a glass, having never heard that Darwinism had been questioned. And so he came home gaily, happily with his bunch of Christmas presents for the wife and little ones, stroking himself upon their keen enjoyment and excitement. The night before he had taken the wife to see magic at a select London theatre where the intellectuals went, and had been extraordinarily stirred. He had gone questioningly, yet expected something out of the common. "It's not musical," he warned her, "nor farce nor comedy, so to speak." And in answer to her question as to what the critics had said, he had wriggled, sighed, and put his gaudy necktie straight 4 times in quick succession. For no man in the street with any claim to self-respect could be expected to understand what the critics had said, even if he understood the play. And John had answered truthfully, "Oh, they just said things. But the theatre's always full, and that's the only test." And just now, as he crossed the crowded circus to catch his bus, it chanced that his mind, having glimpsed an advertisement, was full of this particular play, or rather of the effect it had produced upon him at the time. He saw a monster glaring at him with eyes of blazing fire. It was horrible. It rushed upon him. He dodged. Another monster met him round the corner. He dodged again, a leap that might have cleared a hurdle easily, but was too late. Between the pair of them, his heart literally in his gullet, he was mercilessly caught. Bones crunched. There was a soft sensation, icy cold and hot as fire. Horns and voices roared, battering rams he saw, and a carapace of iron. Then dazzling light, and by some extraordinary luck escaped miraculously onto the opposite pavement. There was no doubt about it. By the skin of his teeth he had dodged a rather ugly death. First, he felt for his presents. All was safe. And then, instead of congratulating himself and taking breath, he hurried homewards, on foot, which proved that his mind had lost control a bit, thinking only how disappointed the wife and children would have been if anything had happened. Another thing he realized, oddly enough, was that he no longer really loved his wife, but had only great affection for her. What made him think of that, heaven only knows, but he did think of it. He was an honest man without pretense. This came as a discovery somehow. He turned a moment and saw the crowd gathered about the entangled taxicabs, policemen's helmets gleaming in the lights of the shop windows, then hurried on again, his thoughts full of the joy his presence would give, of the scampering children, and of his wife, bless her silly heart, eyeing the mysterious parcels. And though he could never explain how, he presently stood at the door of the jail-like building that contained his flat, having walked the whole 3 miles. His thoughts had been so busy and absorbed that he had hardly noticed the length of a weary trudge. Besides, he reflected, thinking of the narrow escape, I've had a nasty shock. It was a damned near thing, now I come to think of it. He still felt a bit shaky and bewildered, yet at the same time he felt extraordinarily jolly and light-hearted. He counted his Christmas parcels, hugged himself in anticipatory joy, and let himself in swiftly with his latchkey. I'm late, he realized, but when she sees the brown paper parcels, she'll forget to say a word. God bless the old faithful soul. and he softly used the key a second time and entered his flat on tiptoe. In his mind was the master impulse of that afternoon, the pleasure these Christmas presents would give his wife and children. He heard a noise. He hung up hat and coat in the poky vestibule. They never called it hall, and moved softly towards the parlor door, holding the packages behind him. Only of them, he thought, not of himself. Of his family, that is, not of the packages. Pushing the door cunningly ajar, he peeped in shyly. To his amazement, the room was full of people. He withdrew quickly, wondering what it meant. A party? And without his knowing about it? Extraordinary. Keen disappointment came over him. But as he stepped back, the vestibule he saw was full of people too. He was uncommonly surprised, yet somehow not surprised at all. People were congratulating him. There was a perfect mob of them. Moreover, he knew them all, vaguely remembered them at least, and they all knew him. "Isn't it a game?" laughed someone, patting him on the back. "They haven't the least idea." And the speaker, it was old John Palmer, the bookkeeper at the office, emphasized the they. "Not the least idea," he answered with a smile, saying something he didn't understand, yet knew was right. His face apparently showed the utter bewilderment he felt. The shock of the collision had been greater than he realized evidently. His mind was wandering. Possibly. Only the odd thing was, he had never felt so clear-headed in his life. 10,000 things grew simple suddenly. But how thickly these people pressed about him, and how familiarly. "My parcels," he said, joyously pushing his way across the throng. "These are Christmas presents. I bought for them." He nodded toward the room. "I've saved for weeks, stopped cigars and billiards and several other good things to buy them." "Good man," said Palmer with a happy laugh. "It's the heart that counts." Mudbury looked at him. Palmer had said an amazing truth. Only people would hardly understand and believe him, would they? "Eh?" he asked, feeling stuffed and stupid, muddied somewhere between two meanings, one of which was gorgeous and the other stupid beyond belief. "If you please, Mr. Mudbury, step inside. They are expecting you," said a kindly pompous voice, and turning sharply he met the gentle foolish eyes of Sir James Epiphany, director of the bank where he worked. The effect of the voice was instantaneous from long habit. "They are." He smiled from his heart and advanced as from the custom of many years. Oh, how happy and gay he felt! His affection for his wife was real. Romance indeed had gone, but he needed her, and she needed him. And the children, Millie, Bill, and Jean, he deeply loved them. Life was worth living indeed. In the room was a crowd, but an astounding silence. John Mudbury looked round him. He advanced towards his wife, who sat in the corner armchair with Millie on her knee. A lot of people talked and moved about. Momentarily the crowd increased. He stood in front of them, in front of Millie and his wife, and he spoke, holding out his packages. "It's Christmas Eve," he whispered shyly, "and I've brought you something for everybody. Look." He held the packages before their eyes. Of course," said a voice behind him. "But you may hold them out like that for a century. They'll never see them." "Of course they won't. But I love to do the old sweet thing," replied John Mudbury, then wondered with a gasp of stark amazement why he said it. "I think," whispered Millie, staring around her. "Well, what do you think?" her mother asked sharply. "You're always thinking something queer." "I think," the girl continued dreamily, "that Daddy's already here." She paused, then added with a child's impossible conviction, "I'm sure he is. I feel him." There was an extraordinary laugh. Sir James Epiphany laughed. The others, the whole crowd of them, also turned their heads and smiled. But the mother, thrusting the child away from her, rose up suddenly with a violent start. Her face had turned to chalk. She stretched her arms out into the air before her. She gasped and shivered. There was anguish in her eyes. "Look," repeated John. "These are the presents that I brought." But his voice apparently was soundless, and with a spasm of icy pain, he remembered that Palmer and Sir James some years ago had died. "It's magic," he cried. "But I love you, Ginny. I love you, and I have always been true to you, as true as steel. We need each other. Oh, can't you see? We go on together, you and I, forever and ever." "Think," interrupted an exquisitely tender voice. "Don't shout. They can't hear you now." And turning, John Mudbury met the eyes of Everard Minturn, their president of the year before. Minturn had gone down with the Titanic. He dropped his parcels then. His heart gave an enormous leap of joy. He saw her face, the face of his wife, look through him. But the child gazed straight into his eyes. She saw him. The next thing he knew was that he heard something tinkling, far, far away. It sounded miles below him. Inside him, he was sounding himself, all utterly bewildering. Like a bell. It was a bell. Millie stooped down and picked the parcels up. Her face shone with happiness and laughter. But a man came in soon after. A man with a ridiculous, solemn face, a pencil and a notebook. He wore a dark blue helmet. Behind him came a string of other men. They carried something. Something. He could not see exactly what it was. But when he pressed forward through the laughing throng to gaze upon it, he dimly made out two eyes, a nose, a chin, a deep red smear, and a pair of folded hands upon an overcoat. A woman's form fell down upon them then, and he heard the soft sounds of children weeping strangely, and other sounds, as of familiar voices laughing gaily. "They'll join us presently. It goes like a flash." And turning with great happiness in his heart, he saw that Sir James had said it, holding Palmer by the arm as with some natural yet unexpected love of sympathetic friendship. "Come on," said Palmer, smiling like a man who accepts a gift in universal friendship. "Let's help 'em. They'll never understand. Still, we can always try." The entire throng moved up with laughter and amusement. It was a moment of hearty, genuine life at last. Delight and joy and peace were everywhere. Then John Mudbury realized the truth, that he was dead.
It started as a normal day. It was chilly, and Haddington's only department store was gearing up for the Black Friday rush to begin at 6 a.m. sharp. The store's customers were known to pound on the doors before opening even on a regular day, so the staff knew to be prepared for the worst. Or so they thought. First in line was an older woman, Margot, steaming cup of tea in hand. Everyone at the store knew Margot. She always had something to complain about, some expired coupon to demand using. She remarked to those near her in the line that she expects the store to let everyone wait inside until the sales start if they valued them as customers. Nobody responded. Further back in the line was a father and his son, Toby. Toby's dad was headed to the electronics to find a flat-screen TV, but Toby would be headed to the toys to get that remote control car he'd seen all the commercials for. Behind them was Tina, a single woman in her early 30s. She planned to hit every department she could, and she had her list ready. As the sun rose, the crowd grew more and more impatient. A few minutes before the doors opened, the speakers kicked on and a cheerful Christmas tune echoed through the parking lot. The energy shifted as the customers watched the employees make their final preparations through the windows. And then, the doors separated. The sign lit up. The store was now open. Margot used her bony elbows to make sure nobody beat her to the discounted purses she had her eyes on. She grabbed several, leaving very few for anyone else, and began to head back to the registers. Toby hadn't seen his father since the first few seconds in the store, and he couldn't see anything in the massive stampede of adults. Though he was overwhelmed, he kept his mind on that car. Tina had planned to go to electronics first, but as she entered the anarchy of the store, she made the swift decision that her father's gift would come first. The newest, biggest capacity, shiniest blender you can get. She squeezed her way through the crowd towards the appliances. These were the final moments that resembled anything like a typical Black Friday. Margot made it to the register first and plopped the bags down without saying a word. After the final bag was scanned, she took out her credit card to pay. Was it a gust of wind? Or maybe it was her frail, wrinkly hands. Something happened, and she dropped the card. As she bent over to grab it from the floor, her gaudy necklace triggered the conveyor belt to move forward. Her entire body lurched towards the cashier, who screamed and grabbed at the jewelry to no avail. Margot desperately grabbed at her throat to remove the necklace, but it was too tight. She was flailing, choking, desperate to breathe. Her face turned from white to red to purple, and she flailed less and less. The conveyor belt kept pulling and pulling. The gears chewed past the necklace and began feasting on her wrinkly skin. In a matter of seconds, her entire face was pulled off like a sticky Halloween mask, squishing into the gears and spraying blood in every direction. Finally, the belt caught the gray hair she had pulled into a bun and removed it at once, disappearing into the machine like it hadn't eaten in days. For a moment, the rest of her lingered there, half collapsed by the register. From the shoulders up, she was nothing but bloody bone, other than her eyes, which made piercing contact with those screaming around her. But the rest of the store was distracted, because it wasn't just the conveyor belt that suddenly became deadly. It was everything. The motorized scooters near the entrance had started driving around aimlessly, mowing down whatever and whoever was in their paths. Back in the appliances, nearly everything had turned on at once. Hands and faces were filleted away by blenders and electric knives. Shelves collapsed, littering the floor with butcher knives and cheese graters, ready to destroy whatever flesh found its way to them. Everywhere, bloody bodies tripped and tangled with each other. Tina could see all this happening from the frozen food aisle. She hadn't made it to appliances yet when it all started happening, and now she stood in the middle of the freezer section. She was desperate to find a way to escape a store where everything had seemingly come to life with the desire to kill. Toby was in the toys with a few other kids when it all started happening. Heavy boxes were lurching from the shelves, the toys loudly honking and singing and reciting whatever program lines they had. Shortly before this all happened, Toby had made eye contact with a cute young girl on the other side of the aisle, near the dolls. Now he watched as she was swiftly crushed by the child's playset that had suddenly come crashing down from the display over the aisle. Toby had to get to his dad. He turned around to find a way out of the aisle when he stopped in his tracks. 10 feet away was a fleet of remote control cars, although no one was controlling them, of course. Normally, they looked fun and exciting. Now they were menacing. Toby wasn't a big kid, and with so many of them, he didn't stand a chance. As they sped towards him, he turned and ran as fast as he could, quickly hitting the dead end that was created by the falling playset. He tried to find a way to climb it, but he couldn't find anything to hold. At the very last second, Toby jumped onto the shelf, holding onto the metal prongs that normally displayed trading cards. The cars slammed into the playset with exploding bits of metal and plastic flying in every direction. That was close. Toby climbed to the top of the shelf and observed the crowd. He immediately knew he was never finding his father. Tina had finally left the freezer section, but now found herself near the produce. It seemed like the best route to the front doors. She didn't notice that the automatic sprayers above the fruit had gone into hyperdrive, soaking everything around them. Crying, she climbed past overturned carts and the bodies of those run down by the scooters. She didn't see the puddle ahead of her, and her foot slipped the second it attempted touchdown. She landed hard on her back, immediately soaked. A few feet away, the water found its way to the tongue of an extension cord. Tina was killed instantly, along with the dozens of others who were attempting to cross the water or touching anything metal nearby. Toby stood at the front of the aisleway, seeing people trampling over each other, breaking bones and cracking skulls against the floor. The entire grocery section was sparking and crackling, and dozens of bodies trembled in a disturbing electric dance. The sparks were starting to reach the dry goods. Toby knew it was a matter of moments before there would be a fire. His dad would expect him to get out. It would be impossible to try to find him now. Toby surveyed the bloodshed once more, trying to predict the best route of exit. Only then did he notice the people strung up to the ceiling like ornaments tangled in the Christmas lights with blue and purple faces. Were the objects moving? If he didn't go now, he'd never make it. He'd have to use his small size to his advantage. He reached over and untangled a string of lights from the display of bodies and wrapped the cord up in his hands. He jumped from the aisle top, swinging above the panicked customers desperately trying to escape. He let go at the last possible second and hit the tile only a few feet from the registers. On his left, he could see straight into the garden center, though he wished he had never looked. The mowers and saws were having a holiday of their own. The walls were painted deep red, and mangled limbs and dismembered bodies decorated the ground. Toby stayed low, crawling under the registers. He wanted to do nothing more than to stand up and sprint, but he had no idea what was waiting for him past the checkout area. It was getting really warm and harder to breathe. The fire was starting to consume the back half of the store. Toby cleared the registers and stood fully up for the first time. The sliding glass doors were right there, opening and closing quickly like the jaws of a giant metal monster. He picked up a long piece of metal shelf from the floor and started running. Whatever came flying at him, he batted it away with his makeshift shield. Without ever meaning to, he was screaming as loud as he could. As he made it to the entrance, he threw the shelf into the angry doors, causing a temporary jam. He turned and yelled for others to follow, that the doors were open. But there was no one even close. He ran through the doors and kept going until he got to the very last parking space and collapsed, coughing and crying in the freezing cold morning air. He looked around the parking lot. Other than the violent noises leaking from the store, the outside felt rather normal. A gentle snow fell from the sky, and Toby knew that his father was already dead. There were only a few survivors. They all told the same story, but it didn't matter. Authorities called it a group hallucination caused by smoke inhalation. The store had simply caught on fire, they said, and most of the customers died in a panic trying to get out. But the survivors knew better, and Haddington outlawed Black Friday after that. The official word was that it was out of respect for the hundreds who died, but those who knew the truth understood it was a way of making sure it never happened again. But of course, they couldn't be sure of that. Toby turned and left the parking lot, walking along the barren sidewalk towards home. Police cars passed him on their way to the store. He could hear the fire trucks in the distance. As he rounded the corner into his cul-de-sac, it was nearly silent. The fluffy snow acted as a sponge to the sound, and Toby could only hear the crunching below his sneakers. What was he going to tell his mom? But then, he started hearing something else. A familiar, high-pitched electric hum. Breathing deep, he turned around. Just behind him was a remote control car, ready to hit the gas.
Black Friday, written by Brian Renaud, told by Shannon Lee Weber.
It was the first big snow of the season, and the streets were filled with neighbors plowing sidewalks and roads, and the occasional kids having snowball fights. Jack had gotten held up at work, and he knew his partner wasn't going to be happy that he'd be so late for dinner. They were hosting friends, and Jack had promised he'd be there with enough time to help set up. He missed the bus, so the quickest route home would be to walk. He cut through the alleyway behind his work building as he dialed Brandon's number to let him know he'd be late.
Hey, this is Brandon. I can't answer the phone, so...
No answer. Jack thrust his phone and freezing hand back into his pocket and continued walking into the winter storm. After a few minutes, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The city was nearly silent, all sounds getting sucked into the snow, but every once in a while, he swore he heard the unmistakable squish of a boot stepping into fresh snow. The first few times he looked around, he couldn't spot anyone. At some point, almost everyone had gone indoors. The thrill of the first big winter storm was now outweighed by the bitter winds and dark night. Finally, when Jack was certain of the stepping noises coming from behind him, he turned around. He had been walking down a long, straight stretch of sidewalk, and a few 100 feet away was the outline of a slender figure, almost impossibly tall. In the whipping winds and snow, he couldn't see much else. He wasn't even positive the person was actually there, but he didn't feel the need to find out for sure. As he turned around, picking up the pace, he called Brandon again. This time, he answered.
Hey, where the hell are you?
I'm sorry. Look, I called before. I was stuck at work, but I'll be there in 10.
Is everything alright?
Of course. Are Stacy and Nick there?
Just got here. They can't wait to see you. Are you sure everything is okay?
Yeah, it's just fucking freezing out here. Can't see anything. I kept thinking someone was following me.
He turned around, looking deeply in the direction of the stranger. There was no one there.
I think I'm just tired.
Do you want me to stay on the phone with you?
No. Go talk to them. I'll see you in a few.
Okay, love you.
Love you.
Jack put his phone away once again and glanced back over his shoulder. He was still alone. Had there been anyone there at all? It had been such a long day and his eyes were tired. The blizzard would only add to the delusion. He trudged on, walking a few more blocks before he was certain, once again, that he could hear someone following him. He turned around quickly, projecting his best look of anger, but it dropped from his face, as the stranger was now only a few feet away. His sunken face towered at least 2 feet higher than Jack's, the giant eyes fixed directly on him. The stranger was as thin and gaunt as a skeleton in tattered winter clothes. Jack was frozen for a moment, taken aback. The stranger slowly revealed a long, distorted smile.
Why are you following me?
The stranger said nothing. He only continued smiling in that disturbing way.
I'll call the police, asshole!
Jack turned back around, hoping to God the threat would get this guy off his back. But before he could take another step, the stranger said,
Do you want to build a snowman?
Jack sighed. Just another weirdo who wasn't even worth a response. He began walking once again, stepping quickly through the fresh snow. He didn't have too much longer to go. It was quickly obvious that the stranger was still trailing him, and finally he turned back around. Sure enough, the man was only a few feet away.
Do you want to build a snowman?
No, okay? No thank you. No. Have a good night.
The man's gaping eyes stared back with a terrifying emptiness. Jack continued walking. He hated having his back to the man, but it didn't make sense to stop moving. At the next intersection, he'd normally keep going straight, but he decided to take a left and go an extra block out of the way. Jack knew in his gut he was still being followed, and didn't want the stranger to be anywhere near his house. The city was a frozen ghost town. Jack checked every driveway, every porch, hopeful someone would be outside shoveling or clearing their car, anyone to distract this creep so he could just get home. The end of the block was nearing, and he heard the crunching of snow right behind him. Taking a deep breath, Jack whipped around, almost face to face with the horrifying stranger.
Just leave me the fuck alone, okay? Fuck off, you fucking freak!
For the first time, the stranger's smile melted from his face. Jack shivered in the cold. He just wanted to get home. Brandon had just served his guests a second round of drinks when he called Jack's phone hoping for an update. Putting on his coat and boots, Brandon stepped out onto the porch. The winter air whipped his face like the back of a hand, and so much snow fell at once he couldn't see further than 3 or 4 feet away. Jack could be in serious trouble. Brandon stepped off the porch and into the yard. Near the street, he could make out the shape of a figure.
Jack?
They didn't respond, but who else could it be? Brandon continued through the yard, a nearly impossible task in the storm, and the figure came more into view. Brandon realized the shape was much bigger than a normal person, a mass formed by mounds of snow. Finally, he realized that he was looking at a haphazardly made snowman. Clumps of dirt and snow stuck together to create 3 layers, though they were hardly distinct. The center was horrifyingly decorated with 3 buttons, though instead of coal, they were human toes, black in the cold. Emerging out of each side was a long stick, on the ends, 2 severed hands, wearing Jake's gloves, dripping fresh blood into the snow below. Brandon's eyes continued upwards. The snowman smiled back with a half-circle of bloody teeth, chunks of gum and root still attached. Above, 2 disembodied eyes stared back, optic nerves dangling in the wind. Jack's eyes. Brandon doubled over, getting sick into the snow. He was dizzy, feeling faint. The wind whipped against his skin. He reached into his pocket, realizing he'd left his phone inside. Suddenly, he heard movement behind him. The sound of snow being crushed beneath boots.
Do you want to build a snowman? Do you want to build a snowman? Written by Brian Renaud. Told by Ashlyn C. Hafer. Featuring Aaron Holland and Brian Renaud.
Have you met the Sangstons? They are cousins of mine, and they live in Surrey. 5 years ago, they invited me to go and spend Christmas with them. It was an old house, with lots of unnecessary passages and staircases. A stranger could get lost in it quite easily. Well, I went down for that Christmas. Violet Sangston promised me that I knew most of the other guests. Unfortunately, I couldn't get away from my job until Christmas Eve. All the other guests had arrived there the previous day. I was the last to arrive, and I was just in time for dinner. The introductions were swift. At dinner, I noticed a tall, dark-haired, handsome woman I hadn't met before. She didn't look at all friendly. More cold and clever. Interesting. I wondered who she was, but I didn't ask. I was sure someone would speak to her by name during the meal. However, I was a long way from her at the table, and the conversation was bright and amusive. I completely forgot to ask the woman's name. There were 12 of us, including the Sangstons. We were all young, or trying to be young. Jack and Violet Sangston were the oldest, and their 17-year-old son Reggie was the youngest. It was Reggie who suggested Smee when the talk turned to games. He told us the rules of the game.
The name comes from It's Me, of course. Every player is given a sheet of paper. All the sheets except one are blank. On the last sheet of paper is written Smee. Nobody knows who Smee is except Smee himself, or herself. You turn out the lights, and everyone goes quietly out of the room and hides. Everyone is charged with looking for Smee, but of course you don't know who you're looking for. When one player meets another, he challenges them by saying Smee. The other player answers Smee, and they continue searching.
He went on.
But the real Smee doesn't answer when someone challenges. The second player quietly stands beside him. When they are discovered by a third player, they will challenge and receive no answer, and they will join the first two. This goes on until all the players are in the same place. The last to find Smee forfeits the game. It's very amusing. In a big house, it often takes a long time for everyone to find Smee.
As Reggie finished, Violet Sangston stepped forward with a warning.
If you're going to play games in the dark, please be careful of the back stairs on the first floor. A door leads to them. We've always talked about taking the door off. In the dark, a stranger would think that they were walking into a room. You could get really hurt.
A girl broke her neck falling down those stairs.
Reggie.
Tell them how it happened.
She was apprehensive, but if she didn't tell the story, Reggie surely would.
It was 10 years ago, before we moved in. There was a party, and all the children were playing hide-and-seek. A girl was looking for somewhere to hide, and she heard someone coming, so she started to run to get away. She opened the door, assuming it led to a bedroom, but it was the door that led to the back stairs. She nearly jumped and landed at the foot of the stairs, killed instantly.
The room was quiet with uneasiness, but none of us had known her. It wasn't right to feel sad on Christmas Eve. We promised to be safe. We started the game immediately after dinner. Reggie went around turning all the lights off, except in the sitting room where we were. We prepared the 12 sheets of paper. 11 of them were blank, and one of them had Smee written on it. Reggie mixed them up, and we each took one. I looked at mine and saw that it was blank. A moment later, the lights were turned out, and I heard someone moving very quietly to the door. The rest of us waited for a minute before rushing from the room. I had no idea who Smee could be. For 5 or 10 minutes, we were all rushing up and down the passages, in and out of rooms, challenging each other and answering, Smee? Smee! After a while, the noise had died down. I guess that someone had found Smee. Finally, I came across a group of people sitting on some narrow stairs. Smee? I asked. I received no answer. So Smee was there. I joined the group just as 2 other players arrived. Each hurried, neither wanting to be last. Jack Sangston was last and forfeited with laughter.
That's everyone, isn't it?
Reggie lit a match and held it up to the staircase.
9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
He shook his head, laughing.
That's one too many.
The match went out. He lit another and counted again. He got to 12, and his forehead creased with confusion.
There are 13 people here.
Oh, nonsense.
Mrs. Gorman laughed.
You probably began with yourself, and now you're counting yourself twice.
Someone handed him a flashlight, which was much bigger than the match. We all counted as a group. Of course there were 12 of us. Reggie laughed.
Well, I was sure I counted 13 twice.
From halfway up the stairs, Violet spoke nervously.
I thought that there was someone just here.
sitting 2 steps above me. Have you moved, Bernadette?
Bernadette shook her head no. The air shifted as a cold finger seemed to touch us all. We felt generally uncomfortable and unpleasant, momentarily unsure of what to do. And then we laughed at ourselves and each other and felt normal again. There were 12 of us, and that was that. Still laughing, we went back to the sitting room and started again. This time, I was Smee. Violet found me while I was still searching for a hiding place. That game didn't last long. As we prepared for another round, Reggie pulled me aside.
I've got to talk to you.
We went into the breakfast room. What's the matter? I asked.
I don't know. You were Smee last time, weren't you?
I nodded.
Well, of course, I didn't know who Smee was. Mother and the others ran to the west side of the house and found you, but I went east into a bedroom. There's a deep clothes cupboard. It's a great hiding place. I thought Smee might be there. I opened the door in the dark, and I could see the outline of someone there, behind the hanging clothes. I reached in and touched their hand. Smee? I asked. There was no answer, so I thought I found Smee. I went in and closed the door, and I can't describe it. I suddenly had a strange, cold feeling, like something was wrong. I turned on my flashlight, and I was alone in the cupboard. But I am sure I touched a hand, and nobody could get in or out because I was standing there.
You imagined you touched a hand, I said.
I knew you would say that. Of course I imagined it. That's the only explanation, isn't it?
I could see he still felt shaken, but I agreed with him, and together we returned to the sitting room. The others were all ready and waiting to start again. Perhaps it was my imagination, but as we played this round, I had a feeling that nobody was really enjoying the game anymore, but everyone was too polite to mention it. I had a deep, uneasy feeling. I tried to laugh at myself, but I did not succeed. At first, I stayed close to the others, but for several minutes no Smee was found. I left the group and started searching the first floor to the west of the house. I was feeling my way along the wall in the pitch dark when I bumped into a pair of human knees. My hand touched a soft, heavy curtain. I knew where I was. There were tall windows with seats at the end of the passage, with curtains touching the ground. Someone was sitting in the corner of the window.
Smee?
I whispered. There was no answer, so I sat down beside her to wait for the others. That's when I realized I knew who this was. It was that tall, pale, dark woman from before.
I'm sorry. I never caught your name before,
I said. After a moment, she whispered.
Bailey Ford.
She was taking the game very seriously, I thought. I whispered an introduction back, but she didn't respond. I asked another 1 or 2 rather ordinary questions and received no answer. I began to feel a little annoyed. Smee is a game of silence, but there was nobody else around. Why was she insisting on keeping quiet? I turned away from her. I hope someone finds us soon, I thought to myself. As I sat there, I realized that I disliked sitting beside this girl very much indeed. Before, I had wanted to know more about her, but now I felt really uncomfortable beside her. I trembled, wanting to jump up and run away. I prayed that someone else would come along soon. Finally, I heard light footsteps in the passage. I heard the curtains move, and a hand touched my shoulder.
Smee!
It was Mrs. Gorman. Of course, we didn't answer. She sat beside me, and at once I felt much better.
You're not Smee, are you?
No, she's on my other side. Mrs. Gorman reached across me, setting her hand on the woman's silk dress.
Hello, Smee. How are you?
Of course, the woman didn't answer.
Oh, it's against the rules to talk. Never mind then. You know, this game is beginning to annoy me a little. I hope we're not going to play it all evening. I'd rather switch to a nice quiet game, all together by a nice warm fire.
Me too, I agreed.
Can you suggest it when we return? I'm sure I'm being very silly, but I can't get rid of the idea of the extra person on the stairs. Somebody who ought not to be here at all.
That's exactly how I felt, but I didn't say so.
I wonder when the others will find us.
After a time, we heard the sound of feet, and finally Reggie's voice.
Is anybody there?
We're here, I answered.
Is Miss Gorman with you?
Yes.
You've both got forfeits. You've kept us all waiting for hours.
But you haven't found Smee, I complained.
What are you on about? I was Smee this time.
But Smee is here with us.
Reggie ignited his flashlight, shining it directly onto Mrs. Gorman and myself. Between me and the wall was an empty space on the window seat. I stood up, but sat back down again. The room was spinning. There was somebody there, I said, because I touched her. Mrs. Gorman was trembling.
So did I. And I don't think anyone could leave this seat without us knowing.
Reggie seemed to shrug it off. We were not very popular upon our return to the sitting room.
I found them in the window seats.
The tall, dark girl was by the fire. I approached her. So you were pretending to be Smee and then you went away? She laughed, bewildered. Mrs. Sangston approached me.
The two of you kept everyone waiting. It was very rude.
But we were not alone, I protested. There was somebody else there. She was pretending to be Smee. I thought it was her. I pointed to the tall, dark woman. But she's refused to admit it.
It couldn't have been Charlotte. I was with her the entire time.
Charlotte? I exclaimed. She told me her name was Bailey Ford. Violet Sangston went as pale as a ghost.
Bailey Ford?
I confirmed. The cold wind whipped against the windows.
That was the girl that fell down the stairs and died 10 years ago. Her name was Bailey Ford.
Smee, written by A.M. Burridge, adapted by Brian Renaud, told by Samantha Garcia, featuring Erin Holland, Shannon Lee Weber, and Ashlyn Seehafer.
It was the Robinsons' first Christmas in the new house, and the girls were more excited about the holiday than ever. They'd picked the biggest tree they could find, and festive decorations covered nearly every inch of the house. James and Brandon were looking forward to spoiling their daughters with dozens of gifts. The most exciting part? They were planning to catch Santa in the act. They sat the girls down and explained that they'd aim their nanny cam towards the tree on Christmas Eve to try and catch Santa Claus delivering presents. Brandon was planning to dress up and eat the cookies and really put on a show for the kids. He had been a theater major after all before his days at the office. Christmas Eve came, and Christy and Ashley excitedly placed the cookies they had baked for Santa onto the snowflake plate. They were practically begging to go to sleep well before their bedtime, so eager to reach Christmas morning.
We can't forget the milk.
Ashley had come into the living room with a pint of oat milk.
Will that kind work?
Santa won't even know the difference. In fact, his tummy will probably thank us.
Brandon balanced the reindeer mug for Ashley as she cautiously filled it. She set it down on the end table near the tree next to the plate of cookies.
It's gonna be the best Christmas ever, but only if you get a good night's sleep.
And promise to stay in bed.
The girls were tucked in, and Brandon and James headed to the bedroom to finish wrapping gifts. They had really gone all out this year, so they needed every last minute of alone time to prepare for Christmas morning. Finally, they loaded up the big red bag they bought online, and Brandon got into costume. It was time for his big act. James watched from the hallway so he wouldn't be on camera as Brandon tiptoed into the room. He unloaded gift after gift until the tree was totally surrounded with presents, and stopped to eat a cookie and drink some milk before taking his bag and leaving. It was well past 2 a.m. and James followed Brandon in costume back to the bedroom and shut the door.
Let me help you with your sack.
They got into bed together and eventually went to sleep. Christmas morning came, and of course the girls woke up first. They weren't allowed to open gifts without their dads, but they couldn't wait to watch the footage and see Santa for real. As James entered the living room yawning, he heard them giggling and watching the video. He was the last one up. Brandon brought him a cup of coffee, planting a warm kiss on his cheek.
Honey, it worked.
Huh?
We got Santa on video.
No way.
And we have so many presents.
Way too many presents.
And there's even more downstairs.
Who told you there were more presents in the basement, silly?
Nobody told us. We saw his helper bring more presents in.
You saw? What are you talking about?
There's even more presents in the basement. We were so good this year. They ran out of room by the tree.
Brandon nearly ripped the iPad out of Christy's hands.
We got so many presents.
What was she talking about? He tried to rewind the video, but the tablet was nearly dead. He handed it to James, who took it into the office in a rush. It only took a minute to load the footage, but James was frozen with anxiety. Finally, it loaded. He clicked through, estimating the timing. There were a few hours of nothing after the girls went to bed, and then at 1:32 a.m., Brandon enters the camera dressed as Santa. In the grainy footage, he looks really convincing. He delivers the presents, eats the cookies, and leaves. But a few minutes later, someone else entered the screen. A shorter, thin stranger bundled up in wintered clothes tiptoed into the room, eyeing the gifts. He had a long, scraggly white beard that matched the hair spilling out from under his winter cap. In the shadows, he had almost no facial features other than the point of his thin nose. Over his shoulder was what looked like a garbage bag. He stood there in the center of the room for several moments before stepping forward and removing a cookie from the plate. He sniffed it with a strange curiosity and then took a bite. He put the rest of the cookie back down on the plate.
Brandon!
He rushed into the room as James rewound the footage to show him what he had just witnessed. He hoped to God that he was just seeing things, but Brandon clasped his hands over his mouth at a total loss for words.
Who the fuck is that? I think he came in through the laundry room. James, we never fixed that lock.
He was trembling.
James, fast forward the footage.
He did, without question, skimming quickly as the sun came up and the girls entered the living room excitedly in their Christmas pajamas. Ashley fetched the iPad to play the video while Christy helped herself to the rest of the cookie that the stranger had bitten. And then it hit them.
James, we never saw him leave.
The fathers panicked, rushing back into the living room. They didn't have a plan, they just wanted to get the girls out of the house. But as they rounded the corner, it was already too late. The girls had gone down into the basement.
Santa Cam, written by Brian Renaud, told by Shannon Lee Weber, featuring Erin Holland, Ashlyn C. Hafer, Brian Renaud, and Shannon Lee Weber.
John, a young man of 26, was free from work, ready to skate and ski in the Alps and celebrate the new year. He occupied the top floor in one of those old, gaunt houses in which the rooms are large and lofty. The floor below his own was vacant and unfurnished, and below that were other lodgers whom he did not know. It was cheerless, and he looked forward heartily to a change. He was catching the morning boat and planned to pack before getting a good night's sleep. As he filled his suitcase with clothes, the snaps broke off and fell to the floor. He had known it was deteriorating, but had expected it to last through one more trip. Now he realized he had made a terrible mistake. It was getting late, and he'd have to rush to make it to the store before it closed for the evening. Only a few blocks away from home was a second-hand shop. John entered, taking in the warmth, and was greeted by the assistant. "I'm looking for a suitcase, the largest one you have." The clerk took him to the back corner, where there was one large suitcase on display, well outside of John's price range. "Is there any room to haggle?" The clerk laughed.
"We close in 5 minutes."
John panicked and looked around the shop, finding nothing in his price range that would do. "Please, sir, I'm leaving on a trip in the morning, and my suitcase just came apart moments ago. Any bag, do you have anything less expensive that I could purchase?" The clerk sighed deeply. "Please, there's nowhere else for me to go tonight. I'd have to delay my trip." The clerk disappeared into the back, where John could hear him shuffling around. After a few moments, he came out with a large brown canvas duffel.
"Just came in. Good bones, but pretty dirty. Wanted to clean it up before putting it out."
"How much?" It was less than half the cost of the suitcase, and the clerk gave an additional discount for the dirt and grime. As John left the store, the clerk turned off the lights behind him.
"Now go, and enjoy your holiday."
John was thrilled. In just 30 hours, he'd be nearing the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in winter. The night was cheerless. It was miserable, and few people were about. A cold, sleety rain was driving down the streets before the ice-cold wind followed, howling dismally among the big, gloomy houses, and when he reached his home, he could still hear the whistling wind beyond his windows. He passed his landlady, shielding a candle from the drafts with her thin hand. "I'll be going abroad in the morning for 10 days, Mrs. Monks, if you don't mind collecting my letters." She winked at him.
"Well, I hope you have a happy new year, sir, and better weather than this."
"I hope so, too." He shivered as he ascended the stairs. The sleet volleyed against the window panes. He put his kettle on to make a cup of hot coffee and then set about packing. He liked the packing, as it brought the snowy mountains so vividly before him. For the first time, he took a long look at his recent purchase. The bag was not elaborate in nature. A stout canvas kit bag, sack-shaped, with holes around the neck for a brass bar and padlock. Empty, it was shapeless and not much to look at. But its capacity was unlimited, and he was thrilled that he wouldn't have to pack carefully. He shoved his coat, cap, gloves, and skates into the bag, followed by climbing boots, sweaters, snow boots, and earmuffs. On top of these, he added piles of woolen shirts and underwear, followed by thick socks. His suit was next, in case there was a fancy dinner at the hotel, and then he paused for a moment to reflect. It was after 10 o'clock, and a furious gust of wind rattled the windows as though to hurry him. He thought of the poor people he'd leave behind to spend their new year in such a climate, while he was skimming over snowy slopes in bright sunshine, dancing with rosy-cheeked girls. That reminded him he must pack his dancing shoes and evening socks. He crossed the room to the cupboard when he heard soft footsteps on the stairs. He paused for a moment, listening. It was Mrs. Monk's, he thought, but then the steps ceased suddenly and he heard no more. They must have been 2 flights down, he thought, and they belonged to a late lodger. John went back to his bedroom and packed his pumps and dress shirts into the bag. By now, the duffel was 2/3 full and stood upright on its own like a sack of flour. The clerk had mentioned it was dirty, but only now did John see how old and ratty it truly was, faded and worn, obviously subjected to rather rough treatment. As he continued packing, John occasionally thought again about the footsteps down below. From time to time, he was almost certain he heard the soft tread of someone paddling over the floorboards, and they seemed to be getting nearer. For the first time in his life, John felt true creepiness. He had left the room for something, and as he returned, he noticed the top of the bag had lopped over with the extraordinary resemblance of a human face. The canvas fell into a fold like a nose and forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock filled the position of the eyes. A shadow or possible stain, he couldn't tell exactly, looked like tangled hair. I shall be glad of a change of scenery, he thought to himself. In the sitting room, however, he was not pleased to hear again that stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize it was much closer than before, as well as unmistakably real. This time, he got up and went to see who it could be at so late an hour, but the sound ceased and there was no one on the stairs. He went to the floor below, not without trepidation, and turned on the electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the vacant rooms. All empty, only shadows. He called over the banisters to Mrs. Monk's, but there was no answer, and his voice echoed down into the dark vault of the house and was lost in the roar of the gale that howled outside. Everyone was in bed and asleep. Everyone except himself and the owner of these mysterious footsteps. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been the wind after all, although it seemed so very real and close. He went back to his packing. It was getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee up and lit another pipe, the last before turning in. With something of a start, John suddenly realized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous. It was a singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and he hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though he were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet, though he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind, he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of this growing uneasiness, and it perplexed him. More, it distressed and frightened him. Pure nerves, I suppose, he said aloud with a forced laugh. Mountain air will cure all that, he added, still speaking to himself. And that reminds me, my snow glasses. As he passed quickly towards the sitting room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw out of the corner of his eye the indistinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs. It was someone a few steps down from the top. They were in a stooping position, with one hand on the banisters and the face peering up towards the landing. John had found the source of the footsteps. Who in the world could it be, and what did he want? John caught his breath sharply and stood still. Then, after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. The stairs were empty. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something about the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes, he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated at the top of the staircase. Then he walked fast, almost ran into the light of the front room. As he passed inside the doorway, he heard someone come up the stairs behind him and go into his bedroom. It was a heavy footstep, but stealthy, the tread of somebody who did not wish to be seen. That was someone on the stairs then, he muttered, his flesh crawling all over. And whoever it was has now gone into my bedroom. His delicate, pale face turned absolutely white, and for some minutes he hardly knew what to think or do. Finally, he went into the other room, where a few seconds before the steps had disappeared. "Mrs. Monks?" The words fell dead against the curtains in a room that held no other figure than his own. "Who's there?" he called. What do you want here?" The curtains swayed very slightly, and as he saw it, his heart felt as if it almost missed a beat. He dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window, streaming with rain, was all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards held nothing but clothes, and there was no one under the bed. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and as he did so, he nearly tripped over the large duffel bag. A few moments before, it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bathroom, and he did not remember moving it. What in the world was the matter with everything? A terrific gust of wind tore at the windows, dashing the sleet against the glass. He came to his senses. "There's no one here, that's quite clear." Yet even as he said it, he knew perfectly well that he did not believe the words himself. He felt like someone was hiding close, watching him. He went back into the front room, poking the fire into a blaze, and sat down to think. Outwardly, John remained calm, pretending to the very last that everything he witnessed had a natural explanation or was merely delusions of his tired nerves. But inwardly, in his very heart, he knew all along that someone had come up the stairs and gone into the bedroom. He began humming, a bit too loud to be natural, and crossed into his room when he felt every hair on his head stand up. The bag was right in front of him, several feet closer than before, and over the crumpled top he saw a head and face slowly shrinking down and out of sight. He was certain he heard breathing. "Who's there?" He had found his voice, though it was just a whisper. He stepped forward so that he could see all round and over the bag. Of course there was nothing there, nothing but the faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack where it had fallen over, only being 3 parts full, and then he saw for the first time that round the inside, some 6 inches from the top, there ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was an old and faded blood stain. He uttered a scream and drew back his hands as if they had been burnt. At the same moment, the bag unmistakably lurched towards the door. John collapsed back, searching for the support of something solid, and the door, being further behind him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent his falling, and shut with a resounding bang. His left arm hit the light switch and the room went dark. He groped furiously for the knob to turn the light on again, but the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on it swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets, so it was several moments before he found the switch. And in those moments of terror, 2 things happened that sent him over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the floor, and close in front of his face sounded like the heavy breathing of a human being. In his efforts to find the button on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers, and then he realized he dreaded the return of the light. It might be better for him to stay in the merciful screen of darkness. But he yielded to the original desire, and the room was flooded again with light. But the second instinct had been right. It would have been better to stay in the shelter of darkness. For there, right before him, bending over the half-packed bag, stood a tall, bulging figure, greasy and pale in the merciless glow of the electric light. John felt a disturbing familiarity. Not 3 feet from him, the monster of a man stood, tangled black hair sprawling from his scalp. John attempted to grope the door handle, but the man lifted his devil's face and looked straight at him. "My bag." John finally clawed the door open and fell into a heap on the landing, knocking his head against the floorboards and going unconscious. It was still dark when he opened his eyes, and he realized he was lying stiff and bruised on the cold boards. The memory of what he had seen rushed back into his mind, and he nearly fainted again. Could it all have been a dream? He crawled to the front room as the wintry dawn began to peep at the windows, and covered himself with an overcoat in the armchair and fell asleep for several hours.
"What? You ain't been to bed, sir?"
Mrs. Monks had come up the stairs, making a great clamor. Before he could answer, she continued.
Well, there's an urgent gentleman here to see you, though it ain't 8 o'clock yet.
Who is it?
Says he's an officer.
Show him up at once, please. John's head was whirling, and his mind was still full of dreadful visions. The officer apologized for the early visit and explained that a terrible mistake had been made.
We don't know how, but the bag disappeared from the courthouse and ended up at the shop that you went to last night. We've been tracking it down, and the shop owner sent us to you.
John didn't understand. Why would the bag have been in the courthouse?
This bag was evidence in the Turk case.
The Turk case? John went cold. In a flash, he realized what it all meant. The monster he had seen had been David Turk, who recently got off for murder due to insanity. The dirty and much-used bag, the smear of crimson within the top, the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered how Turk stuffed the victim's body into a canvas bag for burial. The ghastly, dismembered fragments forced into this very bag, and the bag produced itself as evidence.
The shop owner was awful upset about it, sir, and told me to come over first thing this morning with this, as you'll be leaving soon.
The officer pointed to the large suitcase John originally had his eye on, but he couldn't find his voice. Finally, he said, "If you can unpack the bag for me, just empty the things onto the floor." He gestured to the bedroom, and the officer went inside for several minutes. John could hear the shifting and rattle of items being unpacked.
Thank you, sir.
He had returned with the large bag folded over his arm.
Is there anything else I can do?
No, thank you. I'm happy to help in any way. I wanted to see him get put away for a long time. The officer looked back with pained eyes. I guess it was just a nightmare, like some part of myself knew it was his bag. I thought I saw him last night. The officer chuckled, though it felt forced. He hesitated for a moment.
You couldn't have seen him last night. Turk poisoned himself right after release.
John's blood ran cold. Poisoned? What time did he do it?
About 10 o'clock.
John's eyes landed on the old canvas bag.
Most disturbing is, he left a note. Said he wanted the same treatment as the woman he killed. He wanted to be buried in this same bag.
The Duffel Bag, story by Algernon Blackwood, adapted and told by Brian Renaud, featuring Erin Holland and Shannon Lee Weber.
Come on, wake up. Wake up, Kathy. It's the day before Christmas. Oh, and there's so much to be
Miss
done.
Buff, it's light out already. You said you were going to wake me really early today so we could go to the airport and meet them.
Come on, up you get. Let's get you dressed.
Buffy, they're going to be waiting for me and you didn't wake me. I know what, they're home already.
Kathy.
Mommy! Daddy, where are you? Daddy!
Kathy.
Mommy? Buffy, they're not in their bedroom. Mom. Miss Buff, they're not home.
I know, honey.
The clock in the kitchen said 8:30.
Kathy, here, put this on, dear. You told me you wanted to wear this dress today. So that's why I ironed it for you.
Miss Buff,
Yes, dear?
why aren't they here?
Oh, they'll be here.
But when I talked to Mommy on the telephone yesterday, she said she would be here at 6 this morning. And I promised her I'd meet her at the airport, her and Daddy.
I know.
And Daddy said he had a surprise he was bringing for me all the way from Paris. It's 8:30, Buffy. Let's go out to the airport now.
Oh, but there's so many things to do. First, you've got to get your breakfast, and we have to finish decorating the tree. And, there's so many things I want you to help me with.
Everything can wait, Buffy. Hurry, I promised to meet them.
No, dear.
Why not, Buff?
Well, I think we'll wait for them here. Kathy,
Yes?
you remember what you promised your Mommy and Dad? That you'd do everything I asked you while they were away.
Yes.
Then, we'll wait for them here.
All right, Buffy. It's noon, Buffy.
I know.
Don't you think they might have called and told us they'd be late?
Oh, I'll go and make our lunch. You must be very hungry.
No, I'm not.
Oh, you didn't eat your breakfast, Kathy.
Miss Buff, I'm not hungry.
Look. Oh, look, it's snowing, honey. We'll have a nice warm lunch, and then we'll go out for a long walk.
They should have called.
I tell you what, Kathy. We'll take our walk first. We'll see the shops. We'll visit. We'll go and see Johnny and your aunt and uncle. Maybe if it snows hard enough, we can all build a snowman. Wouldn't you like that?
Yes, that would be fun.
Well, go get your coat and hat and galoshes, dear.
All right. And when we come back, Mommy and Daddy will be home.
Well, you go and get your things now.
Oh, I'll get it, Buffy. Mommy. Oh, who's this, Daddy? You sound... Oh, from a newspaper. Here.
Hello? Yes, this is the Harper residence. I'm the housekeeper. Well, just a moment, please. Kathy.
Who is it?
Someone wants to talk to me, honey. Will you go get your things?
No. Who are you talking to, Buffy?
Never mind, dear. Go and get your things.
No. No, I won't.
Hello? I see. Yes, I saw the papers. Yes, that was the daughter. No, she doesn't. No. Please, no.
Who was it?
Oh, it was just a man, honey.
It was from the newspapers. Why? What did he want?
Nothing.
He asked about me, didn't he? Why?
Honestly, honey, it was nothing.
It was about Mommy and Daddy.
Oh, it wasn't anything important.
Well...
Look at that snow coming down, Kathy. Get your things, dear. Go on. Don't they sing beautifully, Kathy?
Very lovely.
The street and all the decorations and the singers.
It's very lovely, Miss Buff.
I remember when I was a little girl how excited I'd get. Oh, all the wonderful things to see. The sights and the smells and the sounds. Pretty shop windows and the snow. To be a little girl at Christmas time. To be young at Christmas time. And happy at...
What's the matter, Buffy?
Oh, Kathy.
Buffy.
Let me hold you. Oh, Kathy, darling.
Buffy, you're crying.
Why, look, there's Santa Claus watching us. Let's say hello to him.
You were crying.
Hello, Santa.
Merry Christmas. Oh, Merry Christmas, little girl.
Merry Christmas,
Ah, you're a pretty little girl. What's your name?
Kathy.
Oh, that's a nice name for a nice little girl like you.
Thank you.
And I can tell you've been a good little girl. I saw the way your mommy was holding you.
She's Miss Buff. My Mommy's away. Daddy, too. We're taking a walk to make them come home.
Oh, and where are they?
I don't know. I don't know.
Kathy, come in, darling. And Miss Buff, how are you? Come in. Mother, guess who's here?
Why, Kathy and Miss Buff.
Hello, Aunt.
Hello, Mrs. Cleveland.
Take your things off. We've got a big fire in the living room. And wait till you see our Christmas tree, Kathy.
I'm sure it's very beautiful.
I'll bet Kathy came to see her cousin Johnny, didn't she?
Yes, I did, Uncle Ted. I would like to see him very much.
Do you know what that boy of mine did, Miss Buff?
No.
He found the train.
Oh, he did?
After I took so much trouble to hide them out in the garage, he found them. So, of course, I had to set them up for him. Well, it's the day before Christmas. He's in his room now. Kathy?
Yes, I would like to play with the train.
Of course you would. Johnny!
I can't come now, Daddy. I'm busy.
Cassie's here.
Go on, Kathy.
All right.
I've been on the phone since 7 this morning, Miss Buff, and there just isn't any word at all about the plane.
Look!
A man from the newspaper called the house. I told him to stay away. Did the child know? I think she does.
What did you tell her?
Nothing. How do you tell a child, Mrs. Cleveland?
Look at it go!
What I can't understand is why no word at all. The plane took off from Paris on time, and there was radio contact over island, from what I could find out. But since then, nothing.
You'd better tell her, John. Tell me what?
Well, there was a storm over the ocean. Pretty bad storm. They said...
Miss Buff,
Yes, darling.
I've just figured out something. It's about Mommy and Daddy.
Oh, Kathy.
They're not coming home. They're not ever coming home.
Oh, it's going to be good to get inside of the house, Kathy. Oh, look at you. You look almost like the snowman you and Johnny built. Here, let me brush you off a bit before we go inside.
There's a man there.
What'd you say, darling?
Right there, standing by the door. A man.
Hello?
Good evening, miss. Hello, little girl. Is this your house?
Yes, I live here.
Who are you? What do you want?
Oh, then you'd be the Harper's little girl, wouldn't you?
Yes.
I asked you, who are you?
Now, don't worry about it, ma'am. I just want to take a picture of the little girl. You want your picture taken, little girl?
Buffy.
You're the reporter I talked to this morning, aren't you?
And we'll want one of you, too, ma'am.
Here, get in the house, Kathy. Don't stand there, dear. Get in the house. I'll be in a moment. It's Christmas Eve, Mr. Reporter. Did you know that?
Oh, now, look, ma'am,
It's Christmas Eve. Where's your heart?
Oh, look, you've got to understand. I talked to you on the phone. It was almost 10 hours ago, before noon. It's nighttime already. There still isn't any word about the plane. I represent a newspaper, ma'am. We've got to assume... Well, you know, I don't want to say it any more than you do.
Oh, just go away.
Oh, now, really, I've got to...
Were you ever lonely on Christmas Eve? While outside other people were singing? When there was warmth and love and joy?
I'm just trying to
Christmas Eve. The snow is falling. Christmas Eve. And the child is grieving.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Good night.
Kathy?
I'm in the living room, Buffy.
I just had a wonderful thought.
Yes?
Let's have a secret.
What, Buffy?
Let's not wait till tomorrow.
What do you mean?
We go to our tree and open some of our presents now. Maybe just one. We'll choose the one with the most beautiful wrapping. You can open it, and you can play with it now while I go and fix something for you to eat.
I'm not hungry, Buff. Honestly, I'm
not.
not.
Just some milk and cookies, honey. You haven't eaten
All right.
Well, let's choose. Go ahead, pick one.
All right. That one.
It's from Mr. and Mrs. Anderson next door. Open it.
You open it, Buffy.
Very well. Oh, look.
Very nice.
A carousel. Well, I wind it for you. And we'll put it down here. Now. Oh, that's sweet. You watch it. When it runs down, you can wind it up again. I'm going into the kitchen. Kathy, here's your... Kathy, honey, where are you? Kathy? Your milk and cookies are on the table. Kathy? Are you in your room, Kathy? Kathy? Kathy, honey? Kathy!
Why, Miss Buff.
Mr. Anderson, is Kathy here?
Well, no. Is...
Would you mind asking Mrs. Anderson if Kathy's here? Maybe she came in through the back way.
Well, Mrs. Anderson and I have been sitting in the living room for the last hour. Well, what's the matter, Miss Buff?
Kathy ran out of the house.
Oh, poor child. I can imagine how she must feel.
I thought she might have come over here next door. She just ran out of the house. I don't know where she is.
Oh, a child like that, and what's happened to her today? Wait, I'll get my coat, Miss Buff. I'll come with you.
Paul! Paul!
Want to spend ride, Miss Buff?
Paul, listen.
Hi, Mr. Anderson. Want to ride? You can go all the way down the hill for $3. They've got it roped off.
Paul, have you seen Kathy?
Sure.
Well, where is she?
I don't know.
Where is she, Paul? Where did she go?
How am I supposed to know where she went?
But you saw her, didn't you?
Sure. She was running down the block. I yelled at her to come on over, but she kept running.
Which way, Paul?
Down there, I guess. Where the stores are.
Thank you.
Sure. Merry Christmas, Mr. Anderson. Merry Christmas, Miss Buff.
She hasn't been in my store, Miss Buff, and I'm the only one on the block who's open. Last-minute Christmas rush, you know.
Thank you, Mr. Ruxton.
Say, now, that kid and what happened to that plane today, I'd sure let the police know she was missing.
I think he's right, Miss Buff.
Call them, please. Call them.
Oh, use this phone, Mr. Anderson.
Oh, thank you. Hello, operator. Give me the police. Hello, police. I want to report a little girl who's missing. Kathy Harper. No, you just go in the house, Miss Buff. I'm sure they'll find her.
It's 10 o'clock. They've been looking for 3 hours.
Oh, they have ways. They'll find her.
We waited in that station house. All the policemen who phoned in. None of them.
Well, you just go in the house. Now, I'll send Mrs. Anderson over.
No, really. I'd rather you wouldn't.
Well.
Good night, Mr. Anderson, and thank you. Yes?
I'm Patrolman Reed, ma'am.
Have you found Kathy? There we are. All tucked in.
It's almost Christmas, isn't it?
Yes, darling.
You going to read to me?
Of course. You just lie there.
Buffy.
Yes, darling?
Nothing. Just read to me.
It was the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring. Not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mamma in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled down for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Way to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw open the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave a luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer with a little old driver, so lively and quick I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen. On Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen. To the tops of the porch, to the top of the wall. Now dash away, dash away, dash away all.
Buffy! Mommy! Daddy!
Merry Christmas, Kathy.
Kathy, baby.
Oh.
Hey, it's Christmas. We don't cry on Christmas.
I thought, oh, baby. Baby.
Hey, how about a big hug for me?
Oh, Daddy.
Ah, that's my girl.
Where's Miss Buff?
I was in bed. She was reading to me.
In bed's the place for you. Come on, I'll carry you.
Buff! It's Mommy! It's Daddy!
I know, darling, I know.
Hello, Buffy. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Buff.
We had to make an emergency landing in Newfoundland. Small field communications were shot. That storm.
Yes. Let's not talk about it anymore now.
Buffy was reading me a wonderful thing about the night before Christmas.
Here. I'll put you in bed, Kathy. There you are. Read it to us, Buffy.
Hmm?
To all of us.
Oh, well, I lost my place. Read it, Buffy. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky, so up to the housetop the coursers they flew with a sleigh full of toys. And St. Nicholas, too. And then in a twinkle, I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney, St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back and looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled. His dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk and laying his finger aside of his nose and giving a nod up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down on a thistle. But I heard him exclaim as he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."